Chapter 4 of Maurice Nicoll's Living Time, Passing Time and Time Itself. If the world beyond its natural aspect is first of all four-dimensional, then we must be in some way four-dimensional, if we understand that man and the universe cannot be taken separately. How do we conceive ourselves? We seem bodies having three dimensions, existing in the moment of time called present. This is the appearance of things. If we begin to conceive ourselves four-dimensionally, we must leave this appearance of things and penetrate into a deeper realm of thought and feeling, which must inevitably change the feeling of ourselves, the ordinary feeling of I. The point is that a different understanding of time and a different feeling of I are linked together. All that has been said so far about different levels of consciousness is connected with this view. Let us follow some reflections made by Ouspensky on the question of a different understanding of life gained through a different understanding of time. He divides consciousness into four forms. He regards our ordinary consciousness as a particular instance of consciousness, which he connects with a particular feeling of I, and our ordinary conception of the world as a particular instance of the conception of the world. The first or most elementary form of consciousness he terms latent consciousness, similar to the instincts. The second he terms simple consciousness, in which flashes of thought may occur, as in animals possessing complex organization. A dog may perhaps touch our level of thought momentarily. Such a flash of thought would be a higher form of consciousness for it. The third he identifies chiefly with reasoning, our ordinary power of thought. The fourth he calls self-consciousness, the beginning of a higher consciousness. P.D. Ouspensky, Totium Organum. He connects the fourth form of consciousness, which is not necessarily the highest, with another perception of time, referring to the passage in the Apocalypse, Revelation chapter 10, verse 6, where the angel swears that there shall be time no longer. He observes that there are states of the spirit where time disappears. Quote, in this very thing, in the change of the time sense, the beginning of the fourth form of consciousness is expressed. End quote. We recall that Tennyson reached a new feeling of I, or another self-consciousness, and this was accompanied by a change in the time sense. He was no longer located in that time in which we feel ourselves ordinarily to exist. If we say that he became aware of higher space, in which death does not exist and in which he discovered a new form of himself, we must attempt to grasp what is meant by this term. A four-dimensional world is one of higher space. Our customary consciousness establishes for us a lower space of three dimensions, moving in time. Theoretically, time is a dimension that it is necessary to add to the known three of space. But psychologically experienced, higher space means, to begin with, a complete alteration in the feeling of what one is. Tennyson no longer felt himself a momentary creature running in time, but something timeless, permanent. He caught sight of the fact that there is something above the level of his usual state. Can we say that there is anything new in the conception of an aspect of the world in higher space? Let us take one of the earliest definitions of God. He is defined as the beginning and end. Beginning and end for us are necessarily separated by the passage of time. The coexistence of beginning and end immediately introduces us to the idea of higher space. For if we take time itself as a dimension, the beginning and end of any event or of any person must exist in this dimension. We can, of course, understand that the beginning and end of a stick coexist in the space of three dimensions. That is obvious to sense. But the time dimension is not obvious to sense. This definition of God does not refer to qualities, and I think that we are justified in saying that it deals with dimensions beyond those accessible to the senses. God, or higher reality, lies in the direction of dimensions above those known to us. The definition turns our thought in the direction of higher dimensions. Let us take some examples. God, according to an ancient Orphic saying, and begin quote from Plato, holding the beginning, middle and end of all existence, end quote. And then a quote from Philo, God is withdrawn from both ends of time, for his life is not time, but eternity, the archetype of time. And in eternity there is no past and future, only present, end quote. And now this from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. I am yesterday, today, and tomorrow. There is not a day devoid of that which belongeth to it. The present time is the path which I have opened. End quote. Coming to the Old Testament, from Isaiah chapter 41, verse 4, I, the Lord, the first, and with the last, I am he. And then still from Isaiah chapter 46, verse 10, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things which are not yet done. End quote. And in the New Testament, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. And that's from Revelation chapter 22, verse 13. We find also God defined as that which is, which was, and that which is to come. Revelation chapter 1, verse 8. An order of existence above our natural comprehension is clearly referred to, an order of existence of which Eckhart says, both the first day and the last are happening at the present instant yonder. End quote. A great expansion of our understanding is demanded by these phrases. By no logical argument can I grasp the idea that the first day and the last have simultaneous existence, nor can I understand that the beginning and end of my life coexist. To reach such a standpoint, my ordinary time sense must disappear, and with it my ordinary sense of myself. For this reason we can understand how many writers, such as Kierkegaard, Eckhart, Swedenborg, and others belonging to far earlier periods, have divided men according to their understanding of time, or have spoken about the necessity of overcoming the illusion of time in order to understand our lives aright. Let us think again for a moment how we ordinarily understand time. We certainly do not understand time as a higher dimension of space. We associate time with movement, as the turning of the hands of the clock, or the apparent rising or setting of the sun. Or we think of it as change in appearance, as the change in seasons, or the growth and decay of the body, or as something that splits life into past, present, and future. Following the evidence of our senses, we believe that the present exists, but the past and the future are non-existent and incapable of existing. Where could they exist? In what room or space? One of the peculiarities of our senses is that they work in this single moment of time called now, which is not any real now to our ordinary experience, in which you read these lines. The time in which I wrote them seems to you to have vanished into nothingness. What is this nothingness? In this single moment of time called the present, in which you read this sentence, the visible world appears before you. You cannot see the existence of anything a moment ago or a moment hence, and because you cannot see it, you do not believe in its possibility. Therefore you confine the sense of your existence to this single moment of time, and to this you limit your notion of the existing. You believe that you exist now and only now, and if you think that the souls of the dead remain alive, you believe that they exist in this now and only in this now, in this moment of time in which you find yourself existing, and you believe that they travel along with you in the passing time that is our common experience. Since it rarely occurs to any of us that the nature of our senses makes us what we call the present moment, and the world as we know it, we suppose that the only possible present moment is our present moment. We reason from this basis. To imagine that our present moment is only one point in an infinitely larger present seems absurd. The term existence implies a standing forth. What stands forth to sense we call the existing. The term, however, implies that not everything stands forth, and we know quite well that the senses show us only a part of the totality of things. As regards time, they only show us the world standing forth in the present moment. We cannot see into time itself. We cannot see into this fourth dimension. The world in other parts of time, if we begin to think in this strange way, is beyond the reach of our senses. What, then, is the nature of the reality that we believe in evidentially? Transiency is the main reality. We appear to live in an ever-perishing world. It seems that our life is confined to a single instant at a time. We see everything passing away, forever, as we say, without having the slightest idea of what we mean by this expression. Where does everything go? Forever. Where do our lives go? Certainly they are not contained in a space of 3 dimensions. We witness, apparently, events, people and things disappearing into total extinction, into an absolute nothingness, as the result of passing time. This is the reality of appearances as registered by our senses. There goes with it a particular understanding of life, but all this seeming loss of everything and the fear of losing, the apparent uselessness of so much that we undertake and cannot finish, the confused sense of missed opportunities, the feeling of hurry in life and the thought of the impossibility of going back and altering anything, combine to create one distinct picture of existence and one way of understanding it. This is the sensual picture, and with it are related certain feelings of I, a certain sense of things, a certain interpretation of everything, and ways of taking everything. The idea to which we are giving our attention is that time is a truly existing direction, a containing dimension of the world. We think of our world as a ball in space. It is so in a space of 3 dimensions, and in that fragment of time called this instant, this present moment. But it cannot be so in a space of 4 dimensions. Thinking of time as a real but invisible direction, in which all things have extension, there must be another aspect of everything we see contained in this direction. From this standpoint, the world does not only exist in the known space of the present moment, but in the dimension of time itself. There is a time world, or world in time, that is, in a space of more dimensions than our senses record. We touch this higher space at a point, the present moment. But outside this momentary point, at which a visible world is so brilliantly obvious to sense, there seems, for our natural understanding, to be nothingness, nowhereness, no other space or place or any sort of room for existence. Into this pinpoint of the present, events are entering. From which direction are they coming? Following this line of thought, they are coming from the direction of time itself, which is moving through us, or we through it, and so producing the illusion of passing time. So, in order to think of time itself, we have to think of the direction in which events lie, the direction in which the events of yesterday and tomorrow are extended. We have to think of the world not only stretched out in space, but stretched out in the dimension of time, in another, a higher space. Everything, then, that we see in the world now is a part of something in the time world. Everything is also a world line in higher space. No thing is merely the 3-dimensional object in the present moment that it appears to be for our sensual understanding. Our lives are extended events in this higher space. Our perceptible existence is one aspect of our existence, a fraction of it, and our usual sense of ourselves, only one particular instance of possible forms of this sense. It is evident that the fitting of higher space over lower space reverses our way of thought. It relates us to another way of thinking. From its standpoint, the momentum of visible phenomena does not create new phenomena. New phenomena result from the entry of the 4th dimension into the 3rd-dimensional world of our experience, of higher space into lower. We can think from the natural sense-given point of view or from an entirely different point of view based on the existence of higher dimensions. One point of view will answer some things, the other things. One will relate us to life in one way, which is essential, and the other will relate us to life in another way, in an additional way that gives us standpoints that we could not derive from empirical evidence. If we accept higher dimensions, we will understand that truth cannot be one and the same thing in all states of consciousness. Something of that relative reality mentioned in the description of Erogena's system will be felt. Let us try to conceive further how time can be a dimension. Let us suppose that we are travelling along this dimension as along a road. We travel from yesterday into today, and from today into tomorrow along a distance which appears to us not to exist. We are separated from yesterday by this distance, which is a time distance. Now we realise that distance in space does not mean non-existence. London is distant from Paris by a space interval of so many miles. Along this distance, land, sea, towns and people are extended, and if we travelled along this distance we would see them. Although we cannot see them now, we believe that they exist. We believe that the known dimensions contain their existence. But we have not this belief of distance in time. We believe that this distance is synonymous with annihilation, non-existence. We cannot travel along this distance as we please. Today I'm in my room, and yesterday I was in the same room, but an interval of time separates me from yesterday. I am in the same room, in a different part of time. I cannot again be in the same part of time, and to my natural thought that part of time called yesterday has not only disappeared but has vanished into some dustbin, into nothingness. If I reflect upon yesterday, upon that part of time to which I now stand in a new relationship, and of which I think was, I will reflect upon it as if it were no longer existing, perhaps with relief, and in any case with the certain feeling that my life is no longer there, but only here, in today. All that was said and done yesterday I will no longer take seriously, save in so far as my interests may be affected today, because I will give no quality of is to yesterday. Yet to all that exists in the space of 3 dimensions, however distant from me, I will be quite willing to grant the quality of is, because I know that my body can be translated in space to any part of the world. My mind can go back in time, yet if it does so I call it memory, to which I give the quality of was. The existence of the past and the restoration of the past do not seem possible. In consequence, all my thoughts about the past are coloured by the unreality of was, by a certain impatience or by a certain sentimentality. Now if I were suddenly translated into yesterday with exactly the same thoughts, feeling and memory which belonged to it, I would have no idea that anything unusual had happened. I would be in another part of time, at another world point, with all the experiences belonging to it. I would be living my life at that part of time, the same life, again, as we say. Perhaps we have no right to say again, once we realise the existence of the 4th dimension. If we could see into time, if we could see into this invisible distance, we would see other parts of time and all that was happening in those parts of time. The prophets of old were granted this power of vision. They saw time, they saw the world in time, they saw events lying far ahead. They had 2 sights. Not only that sight which perceives a 3-dimensional world, but another which perceived the 4th dimension. For if time is a dimension that we touch only at a point, it gives a higher space in which all world points exist. It means that just as things separated by a spatial interval still exist, so also do events or states of the world and oneself which are separated by a time interval or by distance in time. Applied to oneself, it means that the life exists in time. In Ecclesiastes, which, as regards the early chapters, is a book about time, the writer sees all that happens coming out of the dimension of time. he says, from chapter 3, verse 1, "To all things time, and to every event under the sun season." End quote. Season brings war and peace, birth and death, finding and losing. He must mean that the quality of time is different from day to day. Events lie in time, and as we reach them, they determine the issue of things like magnetic fields. According to the event and season, so will things tend to fall out. Now we do not see life from this standpoint. We think man creates events. It means that there are tendencies in things that vary from time to time, and that therefore something in the nature of a law of synchronicity is probable, i.e., similar things tend to happen together. Nothing can happen unless the event is present. Ecclesiastes draws a picture of man as under the domination of time, and for him time is not a nothingness, a void, but a structure of events of opposite character through which man is passing. In the first 3 chapters he speaks of time, of the recurrence of things, and in an obscure passage refers to eternity in man's heart. But we can find clearer indications of time being regarded as a dimension. In early Hebrew thought, the extension of the world in time was certainly recognized. The world was not confined to a space of 3 dimensions in the passing moment. The American scholar Taylor Lewis, who lived in the last century, was never tired of pointing out that we completely misunderstand many passages in Scripture because we have lost sight of the ancient conceptions of time. Start quote. According to the Hebrew conception, the future world does not come to us and acquire reality by being present, but we are going into it. The future has as real an existence as that through which we have passed. In the prophetic vision, events are there, even now. Events which require the journey of ages before one can reach them are, to the seer, long since past and gone. End quote. Undoubtedly, the time ideas found in the Scriptures are quite different from our natural conceptions. Some illustrative phrases and expressions in the literature of Scripture are as follows. In the New Testament we find it said that God created the ages. This is a very strange thought. Do we grasp what it means? An age is a period of time. This, at least, is one of the meanings of the Greek word aeon. We probably imagine that if God created the worlds, he created globes in space at a particular moment of time long ago. In the Esdras Apocalypse, the phrase occurs, preparatum est futuratum tempus. Future time is prepared. In another passage from the same source, the creation of the world in all parts of time is indicated. Quote, "For there was a time in the eternal ages when I prepared for those who now exist." End quote. In the Slavonic Enoch, it is said that all humanity, all people who exist one after the other in succession in time according to our way of seeing things, are already created. Every soul was created eternally before the foundation of the world. The souls are sown into the time world from beginning to end, for it was held that to the divine mind all is at once, together, not successive. From this angle of vision we catch sight of the strange view that the world is developing, or otherwise, in all its time length from beginning to end. It is regarded as existing at every point. That would mean that history is alive, always living and changing. It would mean that an age is a living thing. William Blake saw the world in this way, building or destroying itself at all points of time in 6,000-year extensions. The world, he said, is not a globe. The ratio of our senses makes it appear so. The universe is not a number of points separated by immense distances. Enoch sees in his vision everything from beginning to end. He sees also where time, as we experience it, is no longer. Here the time perished, and there is no year, month, or day, nor hour, nor shall they be reckoned. All those emotions which belong to passing time, and perhaps are solely due to the illusion of present momented existence, vanish. We are told that there is no anxiety, sorrow, or violence. It is extremely difficult to grasp this extraordinary idea about time. We cannot imagine existence in another part of time, in all parts of time. It does not seem possible to believe that what lies for us hundreds of years in the past may lie for some other beings hundreds of years in their future. Such a view means that our was, is, and will be are relative. There is no absolute past or future. And now a quote from Macander of the 13th century. To God there is no time. All things are to him one conscientious whole. End quote. All is present. We are living in this vast present, at one point of it. We are not really living in the world of three dimensions, but in a part of living history. In one of the Upanishads, the throne of Brahma is depicted as being surrounded by the days, months, seasons, years and ages, and the indestructible wheel of time which governs all creatures. Sebastian Frank, 16th century, says that the true creation of all human beings is timeless. Since God is timeless, outside time, he creates all things timelessly. Quote, he surveys our whole life as present. End quote. This writer says that we cannot understand the timeless order with our natural reason, but refers to another principle in us standing above the reason, which he calls anti-human. It is anti-human in the sense that it goes clean against our ordinary understanding and can comprehend the timeless order. We can connect this with a higher level of consciousness. All these viewpoints in the same direction to another existence of things in higher space. Higher space is timeless. Our ordinary consciousness touches a minute portion of total reality in higher space, like a revolving mirror that reflects only one part of the surrounding landscape and sets it into apparent motion. The ratio of our senses sets time into movement, and it becomes passing time. Higher space becomes time. Such is the view that confronts us. If we could halt at one moment of time, everything would remain exactly the same. Nothing would move. Such moments are not unknown in conscious experience. Even our ordinary consciousness of time is not always of the same order. There is an ancient description of the halting of time in which the present moment is expanded and felt as eternally existing. So we have a quote now from the apocryphal New Testament. Now I, Joseph, was walking, and I walked not, and I looked up in the air and saw the air in amazement. And I looked up unto the pole of the heaven, and saw it standing still, and the fowls of the heaven without motion. And I looked upon the earth, and saw a dish set, and workmen lying by it, and their hands were in the dish. And they that were chewing chewed not, and they that were lifting the food lifted it not, and they that put it to their mouths put it not thereto, but the faces of all of them were looking upward. And behold, there were sheep being driven, and they went not forward, but stood still. And the shepherd lifted his hand to smite them with his staff, and his hand remained up. And I looked upon the stream of the river, and saw the mouths of the kids upon the water, and they drank not. And of a sudden all things moved onward in their course. So that's page 46 of the Apocryphal New Testament by M.R. James, Oxford University Press. This is duration without time. One of our human moments does not lead into the next moment. Consciousness does not step across from one moment to the next, but halts in one fragment of enduring time. Our human moment is a particular measure of time. It might be different. All the history of the world might be one moment to some being. To God, Scripture says, 1,000 years are as one day. All that we see in passing succession might, to another being, be duration in which quite a different kind of change is going on from that which we see. We cannot see what the extension of everything in time is doing. A life, an age may be changing, not in the sequence of present moments. I do not mean change of that kind, but as a whole. Eckhart says that, quote, if someone had the knowledge and the power to gather up the time and all the happenings of the last 6,000 years, and all that is to come ere the world ends, all this summed up into one present now, would be the fullness of time. End quote. All the history of one century might be a moment or a day for another kind of consciousness. Think what this means. We have to get entirely away from the idea of time as something connected with the clock. We inherit a definite measure of time, which makes us see things as we see them. We see the world in a certain way, due to our minimum of time. And now a quote from Duprel. If there were beings whose measure of time and perception did not coincide with our own, but was shorter or longer, it would follow that the world would be wholly otherwise presented to them than it is to us. This question has been examined by E. von Baer, who has shown that the phenomenal world would undergo a powerful transformation were our measure of time and perception altered. End quote. If it were altered in one direction, we would begin to see the world lines of Minkowski, i.e., another form of the world would appear. And now a quote from Duprel, Philosophy of Mysticism. We mark off a space of time according to the number of changes of nature comprised in it. Their number for us, however, depends upon our subjective celerity of apprehension. That is to say, upon our congenital scale of time. End quote. If our congenital scale of time were different, the form of the world would necessarily change. If 1,000 years became as one day to us, the surface of the earth might seem in continual wave-like motion which, with our ordinary celerity of time, would be the experience of earthquakes divided by long intervals. Ouspensky emphasizes again and again in his writings on higher dimensions, particularly chapter 10 of A New Model of the Universe, that we do not see a simple, uniform world. In some cases we see the time lengths of objects. He says that our present moment includes the time lengths, lifetimes of electrons, for which reason we see solid matter. The minute particles that constitute matter reach our consciousness, start quote, only through their time dimensions, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth. In other words, they reach it only by virtue of their motion and the repetition of their motion. End quote. We see the lives of electrons continually repeated. Electron is not in our three-dimensional world. Duprel says that if the process of nature were quickened, with a corresponding change in our measure of time, we should be unaware of the fact and would be unable to believe that our lives were either longer or shorter than they are now. But the quickness of nature and our congenital measure of time must really be one and the same thing. I mean that it is our measure of time that makes nature appear as she does to us. What she is to herself is another matter. Processes that take centuries in our experience may be merely moments in her life. Plato spoke of the reversal of time. The reversibility of the temporal order has often been considered. One mathematician has suggested that the movement from past to present, as we know it, has some connection with the quantity of the past in relation to the quantity of the future. If the value of these quantities were different, we might know an entirely different movement of time. What would this signify? It is interesting to consider what it would mean. Plato connected the Golden Age with the backward movement of passing time. If time went backward, our entire lives would be different and the meaning of events. For example, no one could kill another person. What for us is the carnage of war would be the raising of the dead. We would live in a world in which physical violence would be impossible. Bullets would spring out of the bodies of the dead and travel accurately into the barrels of distant rifles. Another science would explain it as action at a distance, some kind of magnetic effect, whereas it would be a world line traversed in a new way. Men would be born out of earth, fire and water, the drowned, the burned, the buried. The sea would give up its dead. Quite another causality would exist. Everything would be related in a new temporal order of cause and effect. All the material of our lives as we know them, with all the chains of cause and effect that we connect with them and invent, would be transformed into an entirely new story. It would be like that vision seen by Ezekiel of the Valley of Bones. Quote, "There was a noise, and behold, a shaking, and the bones came together, bone to his bone, and sinews and flesh came upon them, and they lived and stood upon their feet." End quote. Suppose a man died in the desert and passes into dust. Reverse time, and what must inevitably happen? Every particle of him must come together, even though his dust had been spread over the entire world. Pour a glass of water on the carpet, there is no process whereby it can be recovered. Reverse past in time, and every particle of water will arise from the floor and enter the glass. Nothing could be lost. If we understand that time is, we will realize that nothing can be lost. It is this thought of the existence of time itself, of its reality, of the fact that there is no time, that can begin to change the feeling of oneself in relationship to one's life. As long as we believe that only the present moment of our life is actual and all else non-existent or lost forever, we are bound to have one particular kind of feeling of oneself. We can have no sense of the indestructible and living life. Let us look at a form of analogy that has been used by many writers in descriptions of higher dimensions. Conceive a two-dimensional world, a world limited to a surface. For such a world, our world of 3 dimensions would be higher space. Let us suppose this imaginary two-dimensional world to have a very small extension in the 3rd dimension. A sheet of paper can represent it. A sheet of paper has length and breadth and relatively very little thickness, so that its existence in the 3rd dimension is very small. If a pencil is pushed vertically through the sheet, only a very thin slice or cross-section will actually lie in the thickness of the paper. Imagine beings living in the sheet of paper, cognizant of nothing else but their paper world and what lies in it. They would know only the cross-section of the pencil, for this would be all the pencil that would lie in their world. All else would be invisible. They would not know anything about the rest of the pencil, because we are assuming that their relationship to the 3rd dimension is limited only to the thickness of the paper. In a somewhat similar way, we can think of our relationship to the 4th dimension as one that is limited to the thickness of the 4th dimension we experience naturally. That is, to what for us human beings is the measure of time called present moment. The thickness of the paper is the measure of the 3rd dimension for the paper beings, and only what lies within it. All cross-sections of any 3-dimensional objects penetrating their world can form part of their present momented visible world. The rest would be invisible, non-existent, not in their world, though in our world, not in their present moment, though certainly in our present moment. So the pencil itself as an integrated whole would exist in the invisible world for them, but they could never conceive it as pencil. Only a cross-section, which has no resemblance to an actual pencil, could exist in their visible world, and all the rest of it would be in their past or future. If the pencil is slowly passing through their paper world, successive cross-sections of it appear to them. What has already appeared will pass out of their world, be no longer visible, and seem to them to be in the past, in the already experienced. The part of the pencil that has not yet passed into their visible world will be in their future, in the not yet experience. To us, with our higher dimensional vision, all the parts of the pencil coexist simultaneously, its beginning and its end, and it exists as a whole, a unity, having a form and function absolutely inconceivable to paper beings. Suppose we could descend into their paper world and assume the conditions of their existence, learn their 2-dimensional views and habits of thought, and explain to them that their world is only a limited expression of an infinitely larger and different world. What would they say? With their natural minds, they would never believe that the cross-section of the pencil was part of a much greater a more interesting reality, a pencil. It would seem merely great nonsense. They would not believe in the reality of our world, in comparison to which the reality of their world would be relative. Now the reader will see that our world would be outside their time and space, yet everything visible in their world would originate from another world invisible to them, namely our world. At every point their views, based on their senses and on their visible world, would collide with our more dimensional knowledge. And since the feeling of being right is at the bottom of most violence, we would probably find ourselves in danger if we tried to alter their point of view, which would be right for them but only relatively right for us. Their truth would not be commensurable with our truth. If we are justified in making this analogy, then for us, living in a three-dimensional world, our perception of things may be nothing but a relatively real one. The present moment may only show us something comparable to a cross-section, or what I would prefer to call a certain minimum, of a vastly greater containing world, extended in dimensions hidden to our senses, and existing in these directions which are unknown and inaccessible to us. For if we touch the fourth dimension, limiting ourselves only to this dimension of higher space, in some way such as the paper beings touch the third dimension, we must widen our conception of the world and feel that we do not really know our world. The senses show us a section or a minimum. But can we not suppose that mind potentially opens on what is beyond this minimum? The paper beings could only grasp the nature of our world by mind, above the mind of sense. What we see, directly and without effort, would be for them a matter of difficult mental grasping, not through logical reason, but by means of ideas which they did not naturally possess. Actually, our sense would be their mind. We would see what they would have to understand. Idea for them would be fact for us. From this point of view, it is quite possible to think that what illuminates us suddenly as idea is perception of an order of life above us, an order of higher facts. Now, if the pencil passed right out of the paper world, it would no longer exist to the paper beings. They would speak of it as having passed into non-existence. They would say, it was, once upon a time. It would be in their yesterday, to which of course they would not give any real quality of existence, just as we do not. But we would say still, the pencil is, for we would see it in another place, in what would be higher space for them. One point of the analogy is to show us what relative reality means. All that was real in their world of paper would be the higher realities of our world passing through it, immensely distorted. With their convincing visible environment, they would regard such a view as highly improbable. A cross-section of the pencil in their world would appear to subsist convincingly out of itself and to be explicable in terms of itself, to be quite real as it appeared. If they sought to get to the root of the matter, they would study its minuter component parts or atoms, and then they would feel they had exhausted the reality of the object. They would never seek a further explanation in an extension of that dimension, which for them would be passing time and present moment, out of which all movement, objects and events swarm into the range of their two-dimensional life. If the sharpened point of the pencil first entered their world and passed in, they would see a circle of lead slowly surrounding itself with a wooden coat. It would look like growth arising from the point of lead. Growth in our world may be similar. If we tried to convey another kind of knowledge to them, it could probably only be done by means of allegories, parables, or symbols. I said earlier that all function in man is four-dimensional. Any intelligible process has aim or purpose, cause and effect contained in it. But the three can only constitute one whole in 4 dimensions. Any process, such as breathing, digestion, etc., is in time as well as in space. Breathing is a cycle of inspiring and expiring, no part of which can be left out, otherwise it would be useless. The process, then, exists as a whole. If we think of it as four-dimensional and can only be understood as wholes, as complete cycles, that with a certain end in view proceed by a linkage of cause and effect in time order. Process itself cannot be seen by the microscope, save in cross-section. It has often been said that man is composed of levers, not of wheels. Seen three-dimensionally in the present moment of time, he is composed of levers. His bones are levers operated by muscles, and there is no sign of any visible will in him. But four-dimensionally, is he not full of wills, and is not his life itself full of returning cycles? The modern functional point of view, whether in physiology, biology, or psychology, is unconsciously four-dimensional, just as physics is avowedly so. The world, the latter regards, is not the three-dimensional world in which the separation between objects is evident, but another world where relations can exist that are not seen in our sensory world. For the addition of a dimension necessarily gives entirely new relations. What appears to be separated and unrelated in a space of fewer dimensions may be connected or related in a space of higher dimensions. For example, we know that the sides of a right-angled triangle are not related directly, but that the squares on those sides have a relationship. Or consider a crude analogy. The prongs of a fork entering the two-dimensional world of paper beings would seem to them entirely unrelated and separate as 4 points. They would see them in their space as having no connection with one another. We see people in our space as separate, but man is not in space but in humanity. But we see this humanity abstractly or sentimentally, not understanding that it may have continuity in higher dimensions and exist as a whole, of which each of us is a cross-section or certain minimum. All this means that according to the number of dimensions, reality must alter. Discrepant views such as the wave theory of light and the corpuscular theory have their origin in this. See A New Model of the Universe, Chapter 10. The language of continuous waves and the language of separate light quanta are entirely different, yet each is applicable in certain cases. It would be impossible to explain to paper beings the relationship between stationary objects in our world. Our world entering their world would give rise to the phenomena of movement to them. Stationary objects in our world, lying at different angles to one another, would appear to them to be moving. That is, their cross-sections would appear to be moving. An example of this is given by Fechner, Wir Paradoxe von dem Dr. Mises, 1846, in the volume Kleinschriften. In a paper on the fourth dimension, not published under his own name, in which he imagines a vertical red beam of light falling on a sheet of paper, and a yellow beam falling sideways at an angle onto the same spot, so that the two beams coalesce on the surface of the paper. The result is an orange spot. Imagine the sheet of paper to be moved vertically upwards a little way. The yellow and red components of the orange spot begin to separate. The position of the red spot caused by the vertical beam remains unchanged, but the yellow spot begins to move away from it. At the second position of the paper in the diagram, the two beams of coloured light are separated. Move the paper downwards and the yellow spot moves towards the red on the surface of the paper. Move it upwards and the yellow spot moves further away from the red spot on the surface of the paper. Now imagine how this would appear to the paper beings whose world is limited to the sheet of paper. At first they would see an orange zone, which would gradually separate into a red zone and a yellow zone, and it would appear to them that the yellow area moved away under its own force. We would see that the phenomena of movement in the paper world were caused by the entrance of the third dimension into their two-dimensional world, and that through the curtailment in their third-dimensional perception, the illusion of objects moving resulted. If the red and yellow beams made a very small angle, if they are nearly parallel, the movement of the yellow spot away from the red spot would be very slow, as the paper moved vertically upwards. If the yellow beam made almost a right angle with the red beam, the yellow spot would move across the surface of the paper with great velocity, almost instantaneously. Regarded in this way, velocity is a dimension. This thought occurred to Descartes, who was inclined to the view that the length, breadth and height of bodies do not exhaust their dimensional attributes. Weight and velocity might be also dimensions in themselves. So Fechner points out that velocity, as we explain it in our world, may be due to the obliqueness of insertion of the four-dimensional into the three-dimensional. He says, quote, "It all depends on the obliqueness of the yellow beam and the movement of the paper. The more obliquely the yellow beam is directed to the paper, the farther the yellow spot will remove itself from the red one by a given progression of the paper. The quicker, therefore, will its own movement appear. Naturally, when something appears to move in our three dimensions, this only occurs because the beam that it projects into the space of the four is directed obliquely to the three dimensions, and therefore, by the progression of the plane of the three, these are always cut at different places. The more obliquely, the quicker the movement appears to be. If the movement is curvilinear, this only results from a curved aspect of the beam. This now leads to new food for reflection. First of all, we see that the mathematician has no longer any reason to complain of the increase of work, because he is spared the whole science of mechanics. Everything stands as it stands, and he need no longer calculate the original movement of the world. It continues on its course. To calculate the aspects of space, he only requires to take his variable t as the fourth coordinate of space. On the other hand, the naturalist gains many new aspects of nature. Just to mention one briefly. If we see a planet revolving in a circle, this only results from the planet extending spirally or corkscrew fashion into the space of the four. As now the plane of the three, in which the planet finds itself at every moment, traverses this spiral beam in the same way as formerly the plane of the two, it appears as if the planet revolved in it. It is therefore evident that the universe must be considered as a growth of spiral filaments, and the whole science of astronomy as a microscopic part of botany. But the most important of all are the deductions for practical life. Only now will man recognise clearly that he gains nothing with his reduction of everything to ashes and his running about. In reality, he does not move from the spot." End quote. Fechner conceived the invisible aspect of the world only in terms of a fourth dimension added to the three of space. But he saw in this fantasy that with the addition of another dimension, our whole way of looking at things must entirely change. Ouspensky observes that if the phenomenon of velocity is connected with the angle of insertion of the higher dimensional into our three-dimensional world, then we must know of some limiting velocity in our world, because angles themselves are limited. Quote, "The sensation of a velocity may be the sensation of the penetration into consciousness of one of the dimensions of higher space unknown to us. Velocity can be regarded as an angle. An angle has naturally a limit in one direction and in another." End quote from A New Model of the Universe. It is in this way the limiting velocity of light round which the theory of relativity is built can be explained. Ouspensky approaches the question of velocity and angle from a standpoint that is different from Fechner's, and I must refer the reader to the entire chapter 10 of Ouspensky, from which the above is taken. In connection with the view that we experience the properties of higher dimensions as phenomena of movement in our three-dimensional space, he remarks that animals may not live in the same world as we do. The third dimension may be for them in the nature of a higher dimension. When we walk past a house, we see an apparent movement of it, but correct it with our reason. He thinks that animals may see this apparent movement as real, so that a house turns about when a horse goes past it, a tree jumps into the road. Animals would then attribute a mysterious power of movement to inanimate life, and thus live in a different world from our world owing to this lack of a clear apprehension of the third dimension in their consciousness. Ouspensky believes that we stand in exactly the same position in relation to the dimension of time as animals stand to the third dimension of space.